you. And Sean, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself again.
Bonjour, my name is Sean. I'm an MSW in clinical social work. Currently have been titled a cultural and spiritual practitioner or worker at NACC, and I'll be doing a lot of work in the schools around trauma aware training, as well as some clinical work. As soon as I gotta get my license, but I'll be doing that soon, and I'm very excited to be here today.
Miigwech. And Michelle?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm Michelle Corcoran, the nurse manager of the MAT program here at NACC.
Miigwech. Nikki?
Hi, I'm Nikki Giardina. I'm the infectious disease nurse at NACC.
Miigwech. And Tina?
My name is Tina. I'm the harm reduction supervisor here at NACC.
Miigwech. And Lacey?
I'm Lindsay King Cooney. I'm the new community and tribal engagement specialist here at NACC. Also a member of the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa, and excited to be here for the first time.
I'm so sorry, Lindsay. Thank you, Miigwech. And then Dr. Zimmerman, if you wouldn't introduce yourself, please, as our guest speaker.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Marilyn Zimmerman. I'm a citizen of the Nakota and Dakota people who reside on the Fort Peck-Assiniboine Sioux Reservation in the northeast corner of Montana. I'm also a descendant of the Turtle Mountain Ojibwe and the Nawa, or the Shoshone Bannock people. I currently serve as the Senior Director of Policy and Programs at the National Native Children's Trauma Center, and I'm the mother of 4 adult children and 4 teenage grandchildren, and they're so fun. I like olders. That's me.
Miigwech. And my name is Kari Robbie. I'm a family practice physician here at NACC, and I work in the MAT program. So if we could just skip the agenda. Thank you. So this is the Midwest Tribal Echo. And today we did the prayer and land acknowledgement. Thank you, Sean Middleton, for stepping in and covering for us on that. And then I'm doing the introductions and agenda, as well as going through Zoom guidelines. And then Tina will be doing announcements. And we have our didactic today on trauma-informed considerations for harm reduction by Dr. Marilyn Zimmerman. And if we have time, we'll be doing a case presentation, and then Tina will help us close. So as far as the Zoom goes, please let us know who you are. You can introduce yourself in the chat. Name, title, organization, email. You can right click on your name on the screen to make sure that the correct name is showing. We ask, if you're able to, that you, sorry, next slide. If you're able to, if you turn your camera on, it's just easier to give a presentation. You can see faces and also to have a conversation. Please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. If we do hear sound coming from you, we might mute it for you. And if you would like to ask a question or need or have a comment, please use the chat or hand raise function. And as always, no protected health information. Tina, if you could please continue with the announcements.
So our upcoming echoes include polysubstance use with Dr. Charles Resnikoff from Hennepin Healthcare. That's going to be our next echo. That's 9/21. And then October 5th, Dr. Robbie will be talking about medication for opioid use disorder and pregnancy. Other announcements. I always like to remind people that there are tons of other echoes out there. A really great resource is the Indian Country Echo website and the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board. They host and facilitate a ton of echoes about harm reduction, MOUD, and tons of other topics unrelated. Stratus Health has some other echoes as well. So if you want information about other echoes, please just send me a text. Not a text, send me a note in the chat and I can connect you. Case presentations, some of you already know, but case presentations are real life clinical scenarios that have presented challenging, complex, or new questions within our practices. This is a way that we can all learn from each other, and anyone is welcome to submit a case presentation. If you would like to do so, let me know in the chat and I will connect with you. This session is, we will be offering continuing education credits for eligible people. So after this session, I'm going to be sending out an evaluation survey. You'll have to complete that, and then that's how you'll get your CEUs for this session. And I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Dr. Zimmerman.
All right, you can all hear me, correct? All right, thank you. So I already made my introductions. What I failed to say was that we are at the University of Montana, which is on the traditional homelands of the Bitterroot Salish and Kootenai people. And that's, always want to acknowledge that, knowing that the University of Montana is working towards is really making some shifts in how it interacts with tribal staff, faculty, and students for retention and recruiting too. So again, we shouldn't be talking about anything that isn't very scary or hard, especially for this group. We've probably been there and done that or seen it. So just know that it is okay to step away from the screen. I won't take it personally unless all of you leave, then I might at the same time. So anyway, just want to really acknowledge this. This is always an acknowledgement that we have at the beginning of every presentation, so people feel comfortable if they want. And it doesn't even have to be about being triggered or having reminders. It can just be that you need another cup of coffee or a potty break. So thanks. So today we're going to look at some basics of historical trauma, which I'm sure you guys have all heard of at least once in your lifetime. Looking very briefly at understanding trauma's impact on development, and then looking at some impacts of trauma on substance use, abuse, harm reduction, and recovery, or really for service providers to think about what those behaviors might mean other than it being non-compliant or as a result of an addiction to a substance. So why do we need to talk about trauma? I think I'm preaching to the choir, but I'll still preach. So we do know that because of the ACEs study that now we can at least correlate that some of the leading causes of chronic diseases in this country can be correlated with early childhood experiences that were traumatic. And so it behooves us, particularly those of us that are in the public health fields in some way or another, to think about the impacts of trauma on our well-being. And in particular for American Indian, Alaska Native people, which there have been some other studies done, ACEs studies done in Indian country. And as no surprise to any of us that are from Indian country, the rates are particularly high compared to the original study subjects. We know that it is preventable. We know that we can heal from the impact of trauma. Always, there's never hope. It's not a life sentence, and it's not necessarily a diagnosis per se as in PTSD, but we can heal from the impacts of trauma. And it asks the right question. I can remember my grandmother who raised me would say to some of my relatives as I was growing up, shaking her finger and saying things, "What's the matter with you? Why don't you sober up and get your kids back? What's the matter with you? Why are you treating that woman violently? Take care of your family." So we know that asking the question, "What's wrong with you?" isn't very helpful, but to ask the right question, which is, what's happened to you? But not just what's happened to you, but how do you make meaning of it? How do you remember it? How has it become a part of who you are as a person because of what you've experienced? So again, reminding us all where I know I'm preaching to the choir, but just as quick reminder that trauma is the experience of a real or perceived threat to life or to our safety or the life and safety of somebody we love, and causes overwhelming sense of terror, horror, helplessness, and fear. And what we always want to emphasize is that the experience is real or perceived, depending on where you are, right? If you're a 3-year-old and dad is screaming and beating up mom, it can be horrifying and terrorizing, right? If you're 22, it can still be hard to watch or witness, but it might not be quite as overwhelming as it would be if you were 3. And it's really the experience of the individual. So we can never say to anyone, oh gosh, I experienced childhood sexual abuse and I got over it, so you'll get over it. We can never tell another person how to feel about what's happened to them or how they should be experiencing recovery from or healing from those experiences. So again, giving us a quick reminder, what we're usually not talking about in America at all ever, not just in Indian country, but in Indian country too, is that it's not a single event. It's not Katrina, it's not a forest fire, it's not a flood. It is usually chronic trauma that our families, our children, our adolescents and families are experiencing. And it's over time or the experiencing those experiences repeatedly, like ongoing neglect or abuse. And then there's complex, which is like chronic trauma, except that it is very often at the hands of our caregivers as children and adolescents that we receive the kinds of traumatic maltreatment or exposure to traumatic events. So that makes it much more complex. We all know that if my father sexually abused me at 15 and I'm raped by a stranger at 18, the event with our father is much more impactful on our psychological, emotional, and spiritual well-being than is that stranger. We're going to talk briefly about historical events of ethnocidal and genocidal intent around the experience of Indigenous peoples on this continent, but for American Indian people and Alaska Native people in this country in particular. Any comments or questions before because I'm rolling through them. Oops. Now I keep having to move the photos to see slides. There we go. Okay, we've all heard of the ACEs study, again, thinking about them. And really, I think I'm grateful that it came out in the late 90s, because I think there are still people that have not heard of the ACEs study, particularly those people that are state legislators, I don't know if you've met a lot of those folks, but they're the local firemen, they're the local farmer, they're the local dairy farmer, whatever it is. And they, do not have access to the kinds of information that we do as professionals. And so it has had a huge impact on the zeitgeist, I guess, of the country around the impacts of trauma on our well-being. And it can take away some of the stigma about what's wrong with you. Why do you behave that way? I went through that sort of thing. So it's a huge, I think, foundation for the work that we're doing today. So here is two ACEs studies when compared with the original ACEs study, which again was well-insured, mostly white, middle-aged Americans in the San Diego area. And so in the original study, 64% of those respondents stated that they had experienced at least one traumatic event in their life, and 12.5% said they experienced 4 or more ACEs. Whereas we see the 7 tribes in the South Dakota study, 86% and 83.16% have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lifetimes. And then in the 7 tribes study, 29% male and 35% female have experienced at least 4 or more ACEs. And in South Dakota, 32.38. So we can see there's some dramatic differences between American Indian people, families, and communities, and their experience of traumatic events in their life. And so with a higher exposure, obviously the consequences to our health and well-being must have greater impact. Linking again to thinking about harm reduction, so looking at the link between ACEs and well-being, And if you had an ACE score of 4 or more, you're more likely to become addicted to alcohol or other substances. You are more likely to have ischemic heart disease, 7 types of cancer, very often suicidal thoughts and attempts, poor academic performance, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and obviously engaging in some risky behaviors. IV drug use being an example of that kind of risky behavior that gets people exposed to HIV/AIDS and other sorts of health issues. Excuse me. For American Indians, many American Indians, not all, and again, I speak as one person, one tribal member, a particular bit of study in this particular area, though I am not the be-all end-all expert, so you all know that. So we'll talk a little bit about historical trauma and the impacts of history on our well-being. So we know that Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart is the first Indigenous American Indian researcher to really develop the historical trauma theory. And she said she has defined it as the cumulative psychological wounding across generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma. And that was a great foundational definition to begin with. I prefer to, Dr. Teresa Evans Campbell's definition, which says a collective complex, oh geez, everything is so different, complex trauma on a group of people who share a specific group identity or affiliation. It is the legacy of numerous traumatic events, a community experiences over generations, and encompasses psychological and social responses to those events. So basic, let me see what the next slide is. Okay, good. So many of us, our tribes, have had these experiences collectively as bands or clans of tribal people. And some of it, of course, is we know about the smallpox blankets, but it's not just the smallpox blanket, just, you know, Europeans bringing diseases to these shores that we had no natural immunity to. Many of us died. There are whole languages that are not spoken anymore, cultures that don't exist anymore, tribes of people that don't exist anymore because of the diseases brought to these shores. Starvation was a huge piece and continues to be a part of the conversation for American Indian well-being. I know in Montana, there are, I think, 12 tribes and 7 reservations, and each of those reservations has a starvation story, a starvation winter story. For my people, the Nakota or Assiniboine people, we had something like, I want to say 300 lodges in the fall, or 500 lodges. And by spring, we had maybe 13 lodges left because the BIA cattle wagons didn't make it into our camps to be able to provide us food. Also, the threats with boarding school of taking away rations from families if they didn't give up their school-age children, that sort of thing. All of these were strategies of colonization. The forced migration and relocation is kind of interesting because it's not just the displacement of us as people, but I'm thinking of a Salish elder who lives up on the Flathead that's just north of Missoula, and they were removed from the Bitterroot Valley, which is probably 90 miles south of Flathead. And it's the Sapphires and the Bitterroot Mountains down there, and it's the Mission Mountains and the Swans up north, right? And so somebody asked this elder, what was the big deal? You know, there's mountains down there and there's mountains up there, and therefore you should be comfortable in that environment. And he said, our sacred songs don't live in those mountains. They live in those mountains down in the Bitterroot Valley. And so I think a big piece of the conversation that maybe have been missed in research is just thinking about all of the ways of sustaining our wellness and our well-being was in the medicines and the sacred songs and the ceremonies that were gifted to us by Creator in those places. For instance, my Dakota people, right, are from the northern woodlands of Minnesota, I don't even know the geography, and that's how bad I am. I've just been there. I think it's Michigan, right through there. And they were displaced in Fort Peck on plains with very few trees. So where did they find their medicines to heal? How did they recreate some of the ceremonies in those spaces that weren't conducive to or didn't have those environmental elements that helped them do that, those ceremonies? Obviously, the genocide was purposeful. And boarding schools. There are some researchers that believe boarding schools may be the most impactful on the well-being of American Indian people, thinking about the removing of generations of children from their nurturing, loving, warm, safe families and communities to be loaded on trains and sent to, as my people on my res were sent from Fort Peck to Carlisle, and via train, and coming back having experienced all sorts of deprivations of warmth, not just physical but emotional, of food, right? Experiencing food insecurity or being punished by food restrictions, being physically assaulted and abused, being sexually assaulted and abused, being having tribal children be encouraged to be enemies of each other rather than allies. The criminalization of the spirituality, so that by the time children went back to their families, they didn't just not understand or remember, they had a belief about what those ceremonies and what that spirituality meant. And it was often it wasn't benign, like, well, it's just not for me. It was very often, this is of the devil, this is something dark and evil and wrong, and we as a people are suffering because of our beliefs, which wasn't true. And again, the displacement on reservations has had a great impact on our well-being. So again, it's really thinking about that exposure of an early generation to traumatic events that continues to affect the subsequent generations. And just wanting to really bring home the fact that, Light and Bear Noise Woman, which is my Dakota name, goes away and she comes back as Mary, and she meets Joey at the same boarding school, and they want to have a family together, and they are so isolated by the time they come back because they don't believe in the spiritual ways of their people. They can't understand their grandmas and aunties when they're talking to them in their language. Maybe Mary is so sexualized that the only way she's learned to survive exposure to adult men is to behave in a sexualized manner that shames and embarrasses her uncle and her grandparents and her parents, that sort of thing. And so they don't have, they clash when they come back. And so they don't have that intimate support that they should have had. So those two are having children, raising them the only way they know how, which was how they were raised in boarding school, without having the benefit of the support of family and community. And I think that's a big piece of the conversation that we are having today as providers, is we're coming in between to be those people that are a bridge to begin to bring healing in all sorts of ways, right? We do harm reduction, we do prevention, we do early intervention, we do intervention, and we're there on the front lines every day, or we're working with people that are on the front lines, knowing that our goal is not just the well-being of an individual, but the healing of a family and community. I'm not going to belabor this. Obviously, trauma impacts brain development. The pathways that we learn for self-protection aren't helpful as we grow older. If we've experienced long-term neglect and or abuse, we are always on high alert. We have higher cortisol levels and epinephrine levels, always looking for safety in our environment, and misreading cues and that sort of thing, because the pathways in our brain are so well developed for seeking safety. I'm trying to go fast because I know tell me when I have to be done. I'm sorry. There's reminders of trauma. You guys kind of probably all know this. Smells in particular can really trigger a traumatic event. I have a great story on that, but no time. So trauma impacts emotional development. So if you ever work with adults.
I'm sorry, just so you know, Dr. Zimmerman, you still have 30 minutes.
30
65.
minutes?
Yeah.
Oh, I
you-
thought this was 30 minutes. I was
Yeah.
like, oh my God, I'm gonna be done in 2 minutes. Oh, well, then I'll
Good,
slow
you're
down.
fine. Yeah.
Okay, let me go back.
Yeah, I want to hear the story.
Okay. I'll say, okay, go back. There we go. Okay, so I worked with a woman who had experienced, she was a childhood sexual abuse survivor. She was in her mid-30s. The sexual abuse began when she was 5, and then to about 10 when she learned to be, or 8 to 10 years old when she learned to be self-protective and be able to anticipate and run away or hide or do those kinds of things, right? Just not be present when the perpetrator was present. But she had a 12 and an extraordinary experience that was the most traumatic of the abuse. She had experienced, they were at a powwow with her aunt and uncle, and it was a cousin, and she wanted to go home. And the cousin said, I'll take you home. And of course, she didn't, being a child, even being 12 years old, thought to herself, maybe this time it'll be okay. It's been a long time. I've avoided him. So it was the last powwow of the season on her reservation, and they got in his pickup and they were driving around, and on the prairie, they usually take a disc or a plow and they plow up all of the dirt around the arbor so that if a fire breaks out, it can't either get in or get out of the area. And so they were driving and the drums were beating, and it was dark out and the songs were playing, and about 3/4 of the way she threw the door open to run away, running across that fallow ground. Of course, it was like a movie. She fell and couldn't get up. He picked her up, threw her in the front seat of the cab. And she said with all of the strength in her whole life that she had always sort of been afraid to use, she used that day or that night. And she kicked him full in the face, and his reaction was to just do this and say, don't do that. Totally changed her view of what safe meant to her, and experienced a very dramatic and traumatic assault. Fast forward, did a lot of healing, found strength and healing in her spirituality and in Western therapy. And she came to therapy one week and she said, guess what happened to me? And I, of course, said, well, what happened to you? She said she would do 5-mile walks every day, just as part of her physical strategies for well-being. And on this particular day, she mistimed. It was a Sunday. She missed leaving the house soon enough, and she did a 5-mile walk, and it went by the powwow grounds and up and over towards her house. And she was a block away from her house, and the street lights went on, and she could smell burning leaves, and she could hear the powwow music. And she just said, all of a sudden, I was just really afraid, really scared, so scared that I went to the center of the street to walk and I said to myself, what am I afraid of? I'm in my own neighborhood. What is this about? What is this physical reaction that I'm experiencing? And all of a sudden she started to add up the drums, the darkness, the smell of burning leaves. And she said, all of these years later, I could not intellectually at first, but my body remembered. Right? And we know that that's what happens. The body remembers. So I think that's a big message of becoming trauma-informed or having a trauma-informed lens is that things are happening to people in front of us that we have no idea what might be a reminder to them. It might be a color, might be a smell, might be a song, right? You might be seeing a name, might be seeing a particular car color and a color, that sort of thing, and that they have different responses in those moments. And sometimes we who are service providers can look at them and think, hey, are you listening? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, maybe they're checked out. And maybe it's not that they're disrespectful. Maybe it's they're just have had a trauma reminder that's triggered some strong physical responses that they're not even aware of. So they can't say to you necessarily, oh gosh, I just smelled this kind of cigarette and it really triggered, and they can't do that, right? A big piece of the trauma's impact on development is really people don't usually get past some basic communications about how they're feeling, not able to recognize or identify or describe really difficulty self-regulating, right? They're all either up in your face, they want services now, or they're quiet and silent and missing appointments because they're disengaging. So we have a hard time, trauma survivors have a hard time with self-regulation, very difficult time describing feelings and internal states because it's often association with our own self-critical, anxious, worried, or ashamed feeling about how we're feeling. And very often trauma survivors rarely experience joy. So the colored crayons are kids and adolescents can say, I'm mad, I'm sad, I'm really happy today, or glad, or I'm, but usually not much more than that. And we need to be able to help people get to the place where they can say, instead of I'm so pissed, like I'm disappointed, or I am so angry right now and I'm explosive. I'm an explosive mom of an adolescent. And just be able to say, no, this adolescent wants to go to a house party and I'm so afraid for her that, you know, what might happen to her, that I'm behaving in such a way that she thinks I'm crazy. I'm screaming at her and doing those kinds of things, right? So we hard to identify, hard to describe, hard to speak to and communicate it to, communicate what you need or what's happening to you. And that can really impact providing services to folks. Obviously, cognitive development, that what do we need to do to be able to learn in a school setting, in a classroom setting? We have to be able to attend, to concentrate, to memorize, to engage, and trauma impacts all of that on our brain development. So very often folks have decreased reading abilities, lower GPAs. Very often they get special education referrals and designations. I used to ask teachers 15, 20 years ago, do you have any students in your school? And they would be public schools on reservations with like 90% student, American Indian student body, who have IEPs because of developmental delays. No, nobody. I said, how about behaviors? And everybody's hand would go up. And I was in a car wreck, so that's why my arm looks like this. I'm not a victim of abuse. Just want to make sure. So they, you know, it really is about their behaviors, and those special education referrals are probably kids being triggered by administrators, teachers, lunch workers, and not understanding what's happening to them. And obviously the professionals not understanding what's going on. Impact on relationships. If you notice a lot of people with addiction issues or risk-taking behaviors, they struggle to gain and maintain long-term relationships. They're often very distrustful of others, might be misreading social cues. There's a slide that I took out about where a researcher had children who had never been abused look at faces, a man and a woman's faces. There was 11 of them, and they went from very sad to very angry, and asked the children who had never experienced abuse where they saw the person become angry. And those children faced like 7, 8, and 9. And then he asked a group of children who had been abused where they perceived anger, and it was 3 and 4, faces 3 and 4. So obviously becoming very skilled at understanding how to read their environment and protect themselves. And that became very important for them to be able to read those cues. But sometimes they're misreading cues because now they've got a coach, or they've got a teacher, or they've got an auntie who may have those same expressions that don't mean what they think they mean. And so in helping relationships, children will probably, or adolescents probably will take a long time to gain their trust. We all know that we're safe adults. We all know that we're caring adults. They don't, and not take some of the behaviors that they sort of put at us personally. Here it is, the big one, the impact on behaviors, impulsive behaviors, aggressive behaviors, difficulty communicating, separation anxiety. What does that look like for a couple? Not just a Head Start child, but an adult couple. What does that look like? Disassociation, looking like they're not paying attention, perfectionism. I knew one student who would rewrite the same page notes 3 or 4 times because it wasn't perfect the first time. So it can, that has got to be frustrating to them and to the people in their lives. And then finally, an impact on worldview. The world is a dangerous place. It's not safe. People want to hurt me. I can't trust anyone. If something bad happens to me, I'm not going to be able to reach out for help. There's no one to help me. I'm not in control, and things will never get better. So really wanting to make sure that we pay attention to some of the facts. This is from the CDC. It's a little bit old data. 50 to 80% of women diagnosed with a serious mental illness have been sexually or physically abused. And that's in the general population. 55 to 99% of substance addicted women have experienced sexual or physical abuse. 90% of women with alcoholism were sexually abused or suffered severe violence from parents. 92% of incarcerated girls report sexual, physical, or severe emotional abuse. And as many as a third of women and 14% of men are survivors of childhood sexual abuse. This is to really bring home the fact that the people standing in front of us may be particularly resilient. They may seem like they're quite resilient, and they are, because if we'd gone through what they'd gone through or they'd walk through today, we probably wouldn't be doing as well as they are. So to remind ourselves that it's there, it's prevalent, and we have to really think about what those behaviors mean in a different way. Someone once asked me, what's the one thing that I have to remember to become trauma informed? And I always say to think to yourself, to ask the question to yourself, what is the function of this behavior that's happening in front of me that isn't about me, but it's all around me? What is the function of the behavior of that adult, that client, that patient, that student, that colleague, right? And what's the function of it? Are they trying to, what are they trying to communicate that they can't communicate in other ways? So there's progression in recovery, and I thought about harm reduction in reference to drugs, though I realize it can be, car seats and seat belts and that sort of thing. But this is a quote from a couple of people that I worked with. One woman said, I felt like everybody was against me, my family, the social worker, the courts. Another woman said, I wanted to get clean, but F-U-C-K, I didn't know how. How was I supposed to make up for all the shit I did when I was using? So they carry that with them as they try to think about doing what's right for their family or themselves. Obviously, there's changes in the roles and relationships among family members, right? Those children who have been taking care of their younger siblings, now mom's back home or dad's back home, they're clean and sober, or they're engaging in some harm reducing behaviors that are thoughtful and really are thinking about the safety of the children. And it's not helpful for the child who's had all the responsibility. Getting clean or even doing harm reduction stimulates fear and loss. What if I can't do it? What if I keep using and I never give it up? And again, using and even engaging in harm reduction can trigger trauma memories. To feel the feelings is required to recover, and sometimes that means different kinds of supports. Very often, particularly parents may not be able to tolerate a child's sadness, anxiety, or aggression. And I'm thinking about the harm reduction of let's find a safe place for the kids for the weekend if you're going to use, right? Will grandma or auntie or somebody take the kids? Well, the kids know what you're going to do, right? So how are they going to be able to tolerate that kid's sadness or anxiety or even their aggressive behavior? Just in the everyday world of being a parent, the child can be a reminder or a trigger just because of their age or their helplessness or their behaviors or attitudes. I remember the same woman who was so insightful. She came to a session and she said, it was my daughter's 5th birthday this weekend. I said, well, that's nice. Yeah, she said, she came out with her dress on and she came into the kitchen and I said she looked pretty. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, there is nothing sexual about this little girl. And I said, no. And she said, I really honestly still thought somewhere in the back of my mind, the residue of the abuse, that somehow I must have done something. I must have acted some way, right, to have been a victim of this person. So, so that is a big piece of the conversation too. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to do. Don't you love technology? There we go. So again, in service industries, we got to think about and understand behavior. So this is out of research or a group of the development of the trauma committee at the Institute of Family Health. They gathered survivors and practitioners and children of and that sort of thing. So really thinking about what is it we need to know as providers, and it really is to understand that some of the problem behaviors that people are exhibiting are probably manifestations or symptoms of their trauma, not necessarily of their addiction, but their trauma. Or even, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think about with seatbelts, for example, is I can remember going back to my reservation, my relative, we went to see her because she was kind of like the den mother of this little town of 150 on my reservation. And I had my college professor with me and we left and he said, you know, Betty Sue is really a brilliant woman. And I said, yes, she really is. And she's astounding, like in her brilliance and her insight and all that. And I said, yeah. He said, but she doesn't wear a seatbelt. And she doesn't require anyone in her car to wear a seatbelt. What's that about? And I said, okay, you've got one car and you got to get 6 kids to baseball. What 3 kids get the seatbelts? Are you going to choose? Are you going to put a seatbelt on and be the only safe one in the car? So thinking about it might not be trauma, it might be, but what is the explanation behind some of the behaviors that some of our clients engage in that might just be sort of a social norm, right? Are you guys thinking of people you know or circumstances? Okay. So again, trauma affects how they help potentially engage in helpful relationships. So if they have a history of abuse, they're often reluctant to engage in or quickly drop out of human services. Trauma has often occurred in the service context itself, right? So yeah, everybody wants to see a child welfare worker come to their door. Probably not. But even so, you know, no one wants to go to sit in the IHS waiting room for 3.5 hours with 2 toddlers, 2 little, or 3 kids under 5 years old. So, you know, it's really contextual and thinking about the kinds of stressors that these families have to deal with just every single day. This was a good, this is one that just resonated with me because I had many, like another lifetime ago, I used to work for Indian Health Service, providing clinical services. And I can remember not looking at the people in the waiting room as I'd go out to go to the pharmacy to pick up something, or I'd go over to the lab, or I was going to go over to X-ray, and I just wouldn't look at them because they always gave me the look like, when am I going to get in? And I'd either get dirty looks or I would get forlorn looks or whatever that might look like. And I didn't realize, and I love this poster, being ignored causes the same chemical reaction in the brain as experiencing a physical injury. It hurts deeply. Who knew that this really high impact way of managing people's stressors and trauma symptoms, it was to just be able to go out there and say, we're a doc down because there's been a car wreck. So a couple of our, one of our docs is at the emergency room. Everyone will be seen today. Let's all relax. and then started thinking about putting diapers out and bottles out and giving access to parents who had forgotten those things because they were so stressed out at home. So again, really, those frequently missed appointments or court dates often present in or often present in a crisis help me now. I know one of the things we talk about with agencies is to think about trauma-informed policies. And I remember writing DNKA on patients' charts, did not keep appointment. And if they had 3 or 4, I can't remember the number, missed appointments, they weren't allowed to make another appointment for, I don't know, we sanctioned them for how many weeks. If we'd have known then what we know now about the impacts on trauma, on memory, on the unwillingness or the fear involved, or just the triggering, the manifestations of the physiological changes in just going into a service provider's agency, maybe we wouldn't have sanctioned people. Maybe we would have been more understanding. And if you're 15 minutes late, maybe that's okay. Maybe we could say, that's okay, Jane, sit down. I know doctor wants to see you. I'll be right back. And we'll get you in. Poor memory. I can remember in healthcare, docs coming out of diabetic clinic and shaking his head and saying to me, I don't know how many times I've told her how much insulin to take when her blood sugar levels gets at this place. I didn't know. It wasn't that she wasn't being non-compliant or not listening or not respectful. She just honestly didn't remember. And it might have been associated with a trauma history. Might not have, but it would have been worth pursuing. Or self-care. And yes.
Sorry, Dr. Zimmerman. I just wanted to make sure, I know that you're almost done with your slides, and I wanted to, there's a couple of really good questions in the chat that I wanted to make sure.
Okay.
So the first is, I don't know if you want to answer these now or.
Oh yeah, no, let's do it.
Okay, so what do you advise regarding decriminalizing our drug use laws and vastly improving treatment services?
Oh my God. Everything that you think I would say, right? Everything that you all wish would happen tomorrow, especially with our tribal courts, where we have our tribal leadership has the ability to make those changes. You know, it's not like Congress where it has to go up through 17 different levels of review, but they can actually make those changes. I think that's another one of the reasons that I love the work that I do is I can talk to people, to legislators like tribal leaders and say, maybe it's not that they're criminals. Maybe it's they have trauma histories and they are using chemicals and booze to self-soothe. Everybody loves their children. Not everybody can take care of their children because of their own, not because necessarily of their drug use, but because of their trauma that they're using drugs to help themselves just cope. And I just think, yeah, we need to decriminalize all drug use laws. I realize that we have to suffer consequences for the crimes that we commit while under the influence, but just to be caught with or to be under the influence of many times, like domestic violence, for example. I'm on the fence on that one. There's an opportunity for change, right? If we don't believe they're bad people, there's opportunity for change. I do actually train some home visiting programs to think about some of the mothers' behaviors and some of their experiences around trauma. And I think it's a beautiful, beautiful opportunity for the home visitors to be trained in how to talk about trauma and the impacts of trauma on mama and baby and family, so that they can say, oh gosh, you know, maybe it wasn't that you were frustrated. Maybe, you know, do you think baby's crying? How did that make you feel? And some moms it makes feel this way, and some moms make feel that way. And sometimes we feel this way because, you know, we associate it with something that's happened to us when we were little. Just being able to have those honest conversations to help some of the young moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas too. Grandmas and grandpas got to influence those guys because they have all the power in that household. Is that anyone, Mark, do you want to ask more about that?
I'm a retired pediatrician, and I'm very impressed with your answers. The other thing I didn't know in my early practice years was poor literacy. In other words,
Uh-huh.
the importance of the first 3 years at learning reading skills. Many of these mothers and fathers don't know how to read, so they don't do it
Mhm,
out of ignorance.
mhm.
And so their children miss out. And so when they start school, they're way behind. 60% of prison inmates are mostly poorly literate, and the police are the only ones that know this.
Mhm.
So in retrospect, I would have used literacy as a screening tool, using my receptionist and nurse to figure who that is.
Mhm.
And advise a home visitor to help with that just after birth and during those first 3 years is key.
Right.
I
Right.
missed both.
It's not, and it might not necessarily be the parents are illiterate, so to speak, but the parents have a lot of trauma history, and it was at a
Yes.
particular developmental phase when they
Yep.
were going through particularly hard times, and they can't read, right? They
Right.
just didn't learn it. I
Right.
again had one of a client who can't remember her times 8 times tables. She's in her 50s. She's learned to add fast. Whatever happened to whatever that traumatic event that occurred in her childhood was during that week when they were learning their eights, right? In I don't even know what grade they learn times tables these days, but back in her day, probably first or second grade. Yeah, no, it's so trauma just is sort of if everything's trauma, then nothing's trauma. So I don't want to say that, but it is grossly understood, under identified,
Right.
and underserved.
Yeah. I also based my home visitor on a program out of Chicago called Cure Violence. They reduced
Oh.
murder rates in high-risk neighborhoods. I suggest you look at it. And they used all Black men and women, ex-convicts. And I thought, how brilliant.
Right,
Those people understand. I wouldn't. They did.
right.
And
Yeah.
they have influence and respect.
Mhm. I know many home visiting on reservations are local community members. And so, they're much more, probably easier to get in for some families. For some families, they want that white practitioner because they feel like that's getting the best care, right? They have a belief about who we are as a people and all that silly stuff. Thank you very much. So again, just bring it home, because I do know I'm up on time now. Thinking about what the handoff is, how do we think about referrals to other systems? How do we create collaborations between our systems to talk to each other so that we can say, hey, we do this trauma screening and she's scored pretty high, blah, 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 or he, or whatever. And I'd like to send for a further evaluation. I know from working at IHS that IHS mental health providers come from all over the country, and they come with their pet therapeutic ways that aren't necessarily trauma informed, although many more are, but not necessarily. And sometimes talk therapy isn't the best therapy. Sometimes it's dialectical behavioral therapy or whatever, right? Sometimes it's movement, sometimes it's mindfulness, those sorts of things. So final considerations. Oh, I did get here. Keep a rigid state of flexibility when you're doing work with people who've experienced trauma. It's never going to go like you think it's going to go. You can't fulfill the goals and objectives of a grant in year one, quarter four. We were supposed to have this done. Probably not going to happen. Learn to be flexible, learn how to count data differently than maybe you were taught in school. Again, building staff and programs capacity around trauma really helps create the opportunity for better outcomes for not just the children, but families too. We have to change the process to include accommodating the needs of any tribal program. So if you guys are going into a tribal community and they say, well, we need this, it's like, well, we don't do that, right? But this is what we do, is thinking creatively about how, not just saying, no, we can't do that, but to say, I wonder how our program could help you do that. What would that look like? And together, maybe coming up with some brilliant ideas that might become an international best practice, who knows? In all of this work, it's all about relationship, always. You can't get anything done without relationship. Tribal leadership staff here are always looking for connection. tribal leaders and tribal elders and community members and families are always looking for allies that want long-term connection. They want your long-term commitment to them and their community. So you can't just say, well, you can't come in and say this is a project for 3 years. You have to be willing to take the risk of saying, I'll be around for the next 5 to 10 years, unless I die or get a job someplace else, but they really are looking for very long-term allies. And thinking about harm reduction in whatever way we think about it, in this case, I think about treatment in particular, but any sort of interaction, any service that we provide to clients, patients, students, colleagues is can be a very sacred space and a sacred responsibility. And so to treat it as ceremony. Thank you. I did it.
Thank you so much. Oh.
Thank you. We're a little over time, so just to be respectful of everybody, that was a really wonderful presentation. Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. I have some questions, I know, so maybe I can email them to you or something.
Okay, that would be great. I'd love it. I'll let you get on with your case study. I'll stop sharing.
Oh,
Bye, everyone.
thank you.